Hello, our dear friends. We are glad to welcome you to our channel again. Today we have a difficult but very important topic: wife's betrayal. It is painful, difficult, and, unfortunately, many people face it. We will tell one real story, share our thoughts, and try to figure out why this is happening, how to live with it, and whether there is a chance to fix everything. Stay with us. It will be frank, honest, and real. It was a warm California evening, casting a soft glow over Beverly Hills. The palm-lined streets sparkled in the setting sun, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming magnolias and expensive perfumes. At one hilltop home, where glass walls reflected the golden light, there was a bustle of activity. The Reynolds home, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel, was hosting a party tonight. This was no ordinary evening, but an event that would cement Michael Reynolds' reputation as one of Los Angeles's finest architects. Michael stood in the center of the spacious living room, holding a glass of aged bourbon. His dark blue tailored suit fit his trim frame perfectly, and the slight gray at his temples gave him a noble charm. At 38, he looked like a man who knew what he wanted and knew how to get it. His brown eyes followed his guests closely, but there was a slight weariness in them, the result of weeks spent drawing up the plans for a new skyscraper that promised to become a new icon of the city's skyline. "Michael, this is fantastic," exclaimed Jonathan Clark, his longtime client and owner of a construction company, clapping him on the shoulder. "Your project, it will change the face of Los Angeles. This tower is like something from the future." Michael smiled, but it was a restrained, almost mechanical smile. He was used to praise, but today his mind was elsewhere. "Thank you, Jonathan. It was a challenge, but I like it when things fit together. Like a puzzle," he replied, raising his glass slightly. "The main thing is that the city commission doesn't put a spoke in the wheel." "Oh, with your reputation, they wouldn't dare," Jonathan laughed, his voice drowning out the clinking of glasses and the light jazz coming from hidden speakers. The living room was filled with people whose names had appeared in the society columns. Investors, designers, a couple of local celebrities who had come not so much for Michael as for the opportunity to show off for the cameras. In the background, by the panoramic windows overlooking the shimmering city, waiters in crisp white shirts deftly carried salmon canapes and glasses of champagne. The party was flawlessly organized, and for that we had to thank Caitlin. Caitlin Reynolds, Michael's wife and hostess, moved around the room with a grace that would make any Hollywood star envious. Her flowing champagne gown showed off her slender frame, and her golden hair, styled in soft waves, sparkled in the light of the crystal chandeliers. She smiled at each guest, her laugh tinkling like a bell, but there was something elusively artificial about this picture-perfect appearance. Caitlin was a master of illusion, a skill honed during her years as a model, appearing on magazine covers and on the runways of New York. "Caitlin, my dear, you look divine," exclaimed Laura, a friend of theirs whose husband owned a chain of restaurants. "Is that dress Dior?" "Oh, you guessed it," Caitlin replied, her voice soft but with a hint of playfulness. "Michael insisted that I pick out something special for tonight. He always knows how to surprise me." It was a lie. Caitlin had picked out the dress herself, spending a sum that would have made Michael frown if he had paid any attention to their bank account. But he hadn't. He was too busy with his projects, his blueprints, his dreams of skyscrapers that would last for centuries, and that was her excuse. At least that's what she told herself. Caitlin walked to the bar, where the bartender was expertly mixing cocktails. She ordered a martini, although she usually preferred wine. She wanted something sharp, something that would shake her up, make her feel alive again. She felt like an actress playing a role in a movie she had long since grown tired of. Everything around her was too perfect. The house, the guests, even her own reflection in the mirror. But inside, there was an emptiness she couldn't explain. "Caitlin, you are the queen today," said the man who approached her, one of Michael's partners. His eyes lingered on her a little longer than was proper. "Thank you, Richard," she said, smiling in a way that made him feel special, but not too much. She had a way of doing that, of walking the line between flirtatious and not giving rise to gossip. It was her game, her way of reminding herself that she was still desirable. Michael watched his wife from afar. He saw how she laughed, how easily she moved from one group of guests to another, how her movements were filled with confidence. He loved her. He loved her the way one loves something fragile, something one is afraid to lose. But lately he noticed more and more often that her smile did not reach her eyes, that her touches became less frequent and her conversations shorter. He attributed it to fatigue, to the stress of his endless business trips, to the fact that their life had become too predictable. But somewhere deep inside, doubt began to stir. "Michael, you have to tell us more about the project." Another guest interrupted his thoughts, a woman in a bright red dress whose name he had trouble remembering. "I heard there's going to be an observation deck at 500 feet. "Yes, that's one of the things," Michael nodded, returning to his role as a gracious host. "We want people to be able to see Los Angeles from a new perspective. Not just the city, but its soul." He spoke with animation, but his gaze kept returning to Caitlin. She stood by the window, holding a martini glass, looking out at the city as if searching for something in its lights that she couldn't find here. Michael felt a twinge of alarm, but he brushed it aside. He was too busy to probe her moods. And yet, when she turned and their eyes met, he saw something unfamiliar in her eyes. Not sadness, not irritation, something deeper, almost dangerous. The evening went on as usual. Guests danced to the tunes chosen by the DJ, and the conversations became more relaxed thanks to the champagne. Michael took Jonathan to his home office to discuss the details of the contract. The room was his sanctuary. The walls were decorated with blueprints of skyscrapers, and on a table covered with sketches sat a model of his new tower, graceful as if carved from crystal. "Here," Michael pointed to the drawing, "we're using a new stabilization system. It will allow us to add 10 more floors without risking the structure." Jonathan nodded, clearly impressed, but his gaze slid to the window, where Caitlin's figure could be seen talking to a group of women. "You're lucky, Michael," he said, lowering his voice. "Caitlin is a gem. Not every woman can keep up her standards like that." Michael smiled, but it was a tight smile. He knew that Caitlin was more than just a decoration in his life. She was his partner, his muse, the one he wanted to create for. But lately, he wondered, what did she want? "She's special," he replied, trying to sound confident. "Always has been." Meanwhile, Caitlin slipped out onto the quieter terrace. She breathed in the cool air, feeling it fill her lungs. The city below shimmered like a scattering of gems, but instead of fascination, she felt only melancholy. Her life was perfect, or so everyone said. The house, the husband, the money, the status. But why did she feel trapped? As if her life was a stage, and she was playing a role that had been forced upon her. She pulled her phone out of her clutch and opened the messages. The latest was from a number labeled Training. "Meet you at the club tomorrow. Don't be late, babe," it read. Caitlin smiled, her heart racing. It was stupid, dangerous, but it made her feel alive. She quickly wrote back, "I will," and hit her phone when she heard footsteps behind her. "Caitlin," Laura's voice was full of curiosity. "Are you okay? You seem thoughtful." "Oh, I'm fine," Caitlin said, forcing a smile. "Just needed some air. The party was a success, wasn't it?" "Of course," Laura laughed. "You and Michael are the perfect couple. Everyone is jealous." Caitlin nodded, but her smile was cold. A perfect match. How tired she was of those words. She went back to the gym, but her thoughts were already somewhere else in the fitness club, where Ryan was waiting tomorrow, with his cheeky smile and a look that promised her something she hadn't felt in so long. The party was drawing to a close. The guests were leaving behind empty glasses and compliments. Michael and Caitlin stood at the threshold, seeing the last of them off. He put his arm around her waist, and she didn't pull away, but her body was tense as a string. "You were great today," he said when they were alone. "Thank you." "It wasn't hard," she replied, her voice soft but lacking warmth. "I'm going to take a shower. I'm tired." Michael nodded, watching her go. He sensed something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He went back into the living room where the waiters were clearing the dishes and poured himself another whiskey. The city outside was shining, but at that moment it seemed foreign to him. So did the woman who had just come up the stairs. Caitlin closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, closing her eyes. Her heart was beating faster than it should. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't stop. Tomorrow she would meet Ryan, and the thought filled her with both dread and excitement. She looked at herself in the mirror, the perfect Caitlin Reynolds, the queen of Beverly Hills. But there was a different woman reflected in her eyes, one who wanted to escape the golden cage. Michael sat in his office, looking at the model of a skyscraper. He loved his job, loved creating something that would last. But today, for the first time in a long time, he felt like his life wasn't a puzzle that fit together perfectly. Something was out of place, and that something was named Caitlin. The morning in Los Angeles began with a familiar symphony. The distant hum of traffic on Sunset Boulevard, the chirping of birds nestled in the eucalyptus trees, and the soft swish of automatic sprinklers bringing life to the perfectly manicured lawns. The Reynolds house, however, was silent. Michael had left for the office before dawn, leaving a note on the kitchen island. "See you tonight. Love, M." Caitlin, standing in her ivory silk robe, looked at the note with a slight grimace. Love. The word that had once made her heart flutter now seemed hollow, like an echo in their vast home. She made herself an espresso, watching the machine make a soft hiss. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, but even it couldn't shake the feeling that her life was stuck in an endless repetition of the same day. Breakfast, yoga classes, meetings with friends who discussed nothing but gossip and the latest designer collections, and waiting for Michael to come home tired and lost in his thoughts. Caitlin sipped her coffee, feeling the bitter taste burn her tongue. She wanted something different, something alive. The party last night left a slight aftertaste of adrenaline. The message from training, that's how she had written Ryan down in her phone so as not to arouse suspicion, was still burning in her mind. "See you tomorrow at the club. Don't be late, babe." She smiled, looking at her reflection in the glass door of the closet. Her green eyes sparkled as if a long-extinguished light had been rekindled in them. Today she would go to the gym, and not just for the workout. The upscale Pulse Fitness Club was located in the heart of West Hollywood, a building with mirrored facades that reflected palm trees and a cloudless sky. Inside, the atmosphere was understated luxury: marble floors, abstract paintings on the walls, and the scent of eucalyptus oil emanating from aroma diffusers. Caitlin walked in wearing a black Lululemon workout set that accentuated her slender legs and tiny waist. Her hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, and a Cartier bracelet glittered on her wrist, a hint of her status that she couldn't help but emphasize, even in a gym setting. The gym was full of energy. Rhythmic music pulsed from the speakers, the machines hummed, and the trainers shouted encouragement to their clients. Caitlin spotted Ryan right away. He was standing at the weight rack, helping a young woman set up a machine. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his white t-shirt was tight across his muscular shoulders. When he turned to see Caitlin, his lips curled into a small, almost cheeky smile. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, coming closer, his voice low and slightly husky. "I'm glad you finally came. I thought you'd change your mind." "I'm not one to back down," Caitlin replied, tilting her head slightly. Her tone was playful, but there was genuine confidence in it. She knew how to make an impression, and she was enjoying the moment. Ryan led her to the functional training area, where a small group had already gathered. He was a professional. His movements were precise, his voice confident, his instructions clear. But Caitlin noticed the way his eyes lingered on her a little longer than on the others. It wasn't just a trainer checking her form. It was something more, a spark that had ignited between them the previous week, when she'd first signed up for his class. "Keep your back straight, Caitlin," he said, coming up to her as she was lifting the kettlebell. His hand brushed the small of her back, as if correcting her posture. The touch was fleeting, but electrifying. She felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the workout. "I try," she answered, looking him straight in the eyes. Her voice was a little quieter than necessary, almost intimate. Ryan smiled, but didn't back down. He was younger than she was, maybe 5, maybe 7 years, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made her feel not like the wife of a successful architect, but just a woman. Desirable. Alive. After her workout, Caitlin stayed in the gym, pretending to stretch. She knew Ryan would come over, it was inevitable, and he didn't keep her waiting. With a towel over his shoulder, he sat down next to her on the bench, wiping sweat from his temple. "Not bad for a newbie," he said with a wink. "Although, judging by your form, you're clearly not a newbie to the sport." "I know how to keep myself in shape," Caitlin replied, pushing a strand of hair out of her face. "But you know, I've always liked to try new things." Her words hung in the air, a hint that could be interpreted in many ways. Ryan narrowed his eyes, as if assessing how far she was willing to go. He was not one to pass up an opportunity. At 30, he had learned to read people, especially women who were looking to him not only as a coach, but as an adventurer. Caitlin was different, not just a bored housewife. She was a trophy, a challenge, a ticket to a world he could only dream of. "Then maybe we should try something more difficult," he suggested, lowering his voice. "I do private training. I can show you a couple of techniques that aren't for everyone." Caitlin laughed, but it was more flirtatious than mocking. She could feel her heart racing, adrenaline mixing with anticipation. It was dangerous, but that was what she liked. "Sounds tempting," she replied, standing up and adjusting the strap of her top. "When do we start?" "Same time tomorrow," Ryan suggested, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'll clear the window for you." "Deal," Caitlin nodded, feeling her cheeks flush slightly. She turned and headed toward the locker room, knowing he was watching her, and she liked it. Back at home, Caitlin dropped her gym bag by the door and walked into the bathroom. She turned on the shower, letting the hot stream wash away the sweat and tension. But her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Ryan, about his smile, about the way his hand brushed her back. It was stupid, reckless, but she couldn't stop herself. Her life with Michael was perfect on paper, but she felt like a bird trapped in a crystal cage. Ryan was her chance to escape, if only for a moment. She stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a soft towel, and looked at her reflection in the foggy mirror. Her skin was glowing, her eyes were bright, and she knew it wasn't from training. It was a feeling she'd long forgotten, the feeling of being back in the game. Caitlin walked down to the living room, where the scent of flowers from last night's party still lingered. She poured herself a glass of white wine and sat on the couch, looking out at the city through the picture windows. Los Angeles was as sparkling as ever, but today it felt less like a backdrop to her life and more like a stage for her to play a new role. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a new text from Ryan. "You were awesome today. Tomorrow will be even better." Caitlin smiled, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to reply with something witty, but not too revealing. Finally, she wrote, "Let's see if you can surprise me." After sending the text, she leaned back on the couch, feeling her pulse quicken. This was the first step on a path that could lead her to the abyss, but she was willing to take the risk. Meanwhile, Michael sat in his downtown office, his desk covered in blueprints, his computer screen displaying a 3D model of the skyscraper he'd been working on for months. He loved this part of the job, the moment when lines and numbers turned into something tangible, a building that would stand for decades. But today, his thoughts kept returning to Caitlin. He noticed how she had changed in the last few weeks. She was leaving the house more often, citing meetings with friends or exercise. Her voice, when she spoke to him, was soft, but somehow distant. Michael tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, that they were both tired of the routine. But something deep inside told him that things were not that simple. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the photograph on the table, his and Caitlin's wedding photo. She was in a white dress, her smile bright, and he was looking at her like she was the center of his world. Things had been different then. They hadn't just been a couple back then, they'd been a team, ready to take on the world. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. Michael picked up his phone and texted Caitlin, "How was your day? Maybe we can grab dinner." He sent the message and waited for a response, but the screen remained blank. He sighed and turned back to his drawings, trying to drown his thoughts in his work. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that this evening was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would change their lives forever. Caitlin, sitting on the couch, saw Michael's text, but was in no hurry to respond. She felt a slight twinge of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the anticipation of tomorrow. She finished her wine and went up to the bedroom, leaving her phone on the table. Her thoughts were occupied with Ryan, his voice, his gaze. She knew she was playing with fire, but the fire was too tempting to stop. Morning arrived at the Reynolds house with a deceptive silence. Soft light poured through the picture windows, painting the marble floors of the kitchen in warm tones. Somewhere in the garden, a bird was chirping, but its song was drowned out by the subtle hum of the coffee machine, which Caitlin turned on from the counter. The house, usually filled with light movement, the footsteps of servants, the clink of dishes, the distant hum of the television today seemed frozen, as if holding its breath. Michael Reynolds had returned from a 3-day business trip to San Francisco, and this morning should have been the moment of their reunion. But instead of the warmth of a meeting, the air in the house was saturated with something elusively heavy. Michael came down the stairs, his suitcase still by the front door where he had left it the night before. He was wearing a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark pants, slightly wrinkled from the long flight. His face, usually calm and focused, showed signs of fatigue, dark circles under his eyes, a light stubble that he had not had time to shave. The business trip had been a success. A contract to renovate an old building in downtown San Francisco had been signed, and this opened up new prospects for his firm. But even this triumph could not drown out the strange feeling that had settled in him on the plane. Something was wrong. Caitlin stood with her back to him, stirring the sugar in her espresso. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was pulled back into a low bun, and the silk robe tied at her waist emphasized her frailty. She didn't turn around when she heard his footsteps, and the silence cut Michael harder than he expected. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice light. He walked over to the kitchen island and poured himself some water from the glass pitcher next to it. Caitlin finally turned, a smile lighting her face, but it was strained, as if forced by habit. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but lacking the warmth Michael was accustomed to hearing. "How was the trip?" "Good luck," Michael nodded, putting his glass on the tabletop. "The contract is signed, the client is happy. And how are you? What's new?" Caitlin shrugged, looking out the window at their manicured garden. "Nothing special. Met Laura, went to a club. The usual routine." Her words were flat, almost mechanical, and Michael felt a small stab of irritation. He knew their lives had become too predictable lately, but her distance seemed more than just boredom. He wanted to go over, to put his arms around her, to feel her warmth, but something in her posture, the tenseness of her shoulders, the way her arms were crossed made him stop. "You look tired," he noted, trying to soften his tone. "Is everything okay?" Caitlin looked at him, her green eyes meeting him briefly before they slid away. "Just didn't get enough sleep," she said, taking a sip of coffee. "The party was exhausting, you know, and I went to bed late last night." Michael nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer. He noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly as she set the cup down on the counter. It was almost imperceptible, but he knew her too well, or thought he did. They sat down to breakfast in the dining room, where a plate of fruit and toast prepared by their housekeeper, who had gone to the market, were already on the table. Michael tried to make conversation, telling them about his trip, about how a client had insisted on dining at a restaurant overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, about how San Francisco was shrouded in fog in the mornings. Caitlin listened, nodded, asked the usual questions, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. She was thinking about her workout with Ryan the day before, about his laugh, about the way he had looked at her as they drank smoothies at the club's bar. These memories left her with a mixture of excitement and guilt, which she tried to hide behind a smile. Michael, watching her, felt his patience stretching like a string. He wanted to ask her what was going on, but he was afraid of the answer. Instead, he decided to change the subject. "How about we go to Santa Barbara for the weekend?" he suggested, cutting off a piece of pineapple. "It's been a while since we've been to the coast. Just you and me." Caitlin froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Sounds good," she said after a pause, but her tone was noncommittal. "But I already have training scheduled for Saturday. Maybe next week?" Michael felt his jaw tighten. Training. She mentioned it more and more often, but never went into detail. He knew Caitlin cared about her fitness, but her obsession with exercise was starting to seem odd. "Training," he repeated, trying not to sound accusatory. "What, you're training for a marathon now?" Caitlin laughed, but her laugh was too harsh, almost nervous. "No, it's just, I like it. It helps take my mind off things." "From what?" he asked, and this time his tone was a little sharper than he intended. Caitlin looked at him, her eyes flashing briefly, but she quickly looked away. "Everything," she said, standing up from her desk. "I'm going to take a shower. You're heading to the office soon, right?" Michael nodded, feeling something heavy building inside him. He watched her walk away, her steps light, almost dancing, but with the same tension in them as her voice. He was left alone in the dining room, looking at the half-eaten toast and the remains of her coffee in her cup. Something was wrong, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. After breakfast, Michael went up to the bedroom to unpack his suitcase. Caitlin was already in the bathroom. He could hear the running water and her voice, softly humming a tune. He opened the closet to hang up some shirts and noticed her bag, casually thrown over a chair by the window. It was her favorite Gucci bag, the one she took to the club or to meet her friends. The bag was slightly open, and a white piece of paper was sticking out of the side pocket. Michael paused, his hand hovering halfway to the coat rack. He never rummaged through her things. It was a matter of principle. He trusted her. But in that moment, something, maybe her coolness at breakfast, maybe her evasive gaze, pushed him forward. He walked to the chair and carefully pulled out a piece of paper. It was a receipt from a jewelry store on Rodeo Drive, dated 2 days ago. The amount raised his eyebrows. $1,400 for a man's watch. Michael frowned as he reread the receipt. He didn't have a new watch. He didn't like jewelry at all, preferring simple, functional accessories. His current watch, a gift from Caitlin on their 5th anniversary, was still in its box on his nightstand. Who was it for then? Him. But why hadn't she mentioned the gift? Or... He pushed the thought away, but it had already taken root. He carefully replaced the receipt, trying to keep the bag looking untouched, and sat on the edge of the bed. His heart was beating faster than it should. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. Maybe she'd bought the watch for someone else, her father, a friend, a charity auction. But her behavior, her distance, her constant excuses about working out, it all added up to a picture he didn't want to see. Caitlin walked out of the bathroom, wrapped in a white towel. Her skin was glowing, her hair was damp, and she had a small smile on her face, as if she had just remembered something pleasant. She didn't notice how Michael tensed up when he saw her. She walked to the closet, but stopped when her phone vibrated on the dresser. Michael, still sitting on the bed, watched her. Caitlin quickly grabbed the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as if she was deciding whether to open the message or not. She glanced at Michael, and in that moment their eyes met. Her smile disappeared, and she quickly hid the phone behind her back like a child caught in mischief. "Who's there?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. He stood up, pretending to straighten his shirt. "Oh, just Laura," Caitlin answered, too quickly, "asking if I wanted to go to yoga later." Michael nodded, but his gaze was fixed on her face. She was lying. He didn't know why he was so sure, but her hasty answer, her nervous gesture, her evasive gaze, all of it screamed that she was hiding something. He felt his chest tighten, as if the air in the room had grown heavier. "Okay," he said, turning to the mirror to straighten his collar. "Say hello to her." Caitlin nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly, but she still held the phone in her hand, as if she were afraid it would buzz again. She walked into the dressing room, closing the door behind her, and Michael was left alone. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, a man in an expensive suit, his eyes tired and his lips pressed together. He didn't recognize himself. He didn't recognize them. The rest of the morning passed in silence. Caitlin went into town, citing a meeting with a friend, and Michael went to the office. But his mind was not on the blueprints or the contracts. He was thinking about the check, about her hidden phone number, about her coldness. He loved Caitlin, the way you love something that has become a part of you. But love, he was beginning to understand, did not always mean trust. In the office, he sat at his desk, looking at the model of a skyscraper, but his eyes were empty. He pulled out his phone and opened his text message with Caitlin. The last message he had sent yesterday had gone unanswered. He wrote a new one. "Dinner at 7? I'll pick you up." He stared at the screen, waiting, but there was no response. He put the phone face down and went back to work, but his mind was somewhere else. Somewhere where his wife was hiding the phone and buying a watch for someone he didn't know. Caitlin sat in a cafe on Melrose Avenue, looking at her phone. A text from Ryan read, "You've been stressed today. Is everything okay?" She smiled, but it was bitter. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop herself. Michael was home, and his presence reminded her of her life, the life she both loved and hated. She texted back, "I'm fine. See you tomorrow." After sending the text, she leaned back in her chair, watching the people outside her window. Her heart was beating faster, not from joy, but from the feeling of being on the edge of an abyss. Michael arrived home late, just as Caitlin was in the bedroom. He walked up the stairs, but stopped at the door. He could hear her talking on the phone, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was familiar, the same one she'd used when they first started dating. He stood there for another minute, then turned and walked into his office. He didn't want to know, but he knew he couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Los Angeles was blazing in the hot sun, its skyscrapers casting harsh shadows on the asphalt and the air shimmering with heat. It was cool inside one of the boutique hotels on the Sunset Strip, hidden behind lush bougainvillea. The fifth-floor suite, minimalist in style with dark wood and marble accents, was their sanctuary. Caitlin Reynolds sat on the edge of the wide bed, adjusting the strap of her shoe. Her dress, a light ivory color, was slightly wrinkled, and her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was now flowing around her shoulders in a slight mess. Across from her, by the window overlooking the city, Ryan Collins stood with a glass of whiskey in his hand. His shirt was unbuttoned to the top button, and his gaze, a mixture of smugness and anticipation, was fixed on Caitlin. "Are you sure he won't come back sooner?" Ryan asked, his voice low and slightly mocking, as if he already knew the answer. Caitlin looked up, her lips curling into a weak smile. "Michael's in San Diego until Friday. We have time." Ryan nodded, taking a sip from his glass. He came closer, his steps leisurely, almost predatory. "Time is good," he said, sitting down next to her. His hand rested on her knee, and Caitlin felt her skin respond to the touch with a slight warmth. "But you know, Caitlin, I think you deserve more than stealing moments in hotels." She looked at him, her green eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Ryan shrugged, his smile widening. "I see how you live. This house, these parties, this husband of yours who's always busy with his drawings. You're like a painting in a museum, everyone admires it, but no one touches it. And you, Caitlin, weren't meant to just hang on the wall." His words struck a chord inside her. She knew he was right, but the truth stung. Her life with Michael had been a perfect shell, but inside she felt empty. Ryan, with his bold gaze and the ease with which he broke the rules, was like a breath of air in that suffocating emptiness. She leaned closer, her hand brushing his chest, and whispered, "Then show me how to really live." Ryan didn't respond with words. He pulled her close, and their kiss was hungry, almost desperate, as if they were both trying to prove that this moment belonged only to them. Caitlin knew she was crossing a line, but at that moment she didn't care. She wanted to feel alive, even if it meant destroying everything she had built. Meanwhile, in downtown Los Angeles, in an office on the 30th floor of a skyscraper, Michael Reynolds sat at his desk, surrounded by blueprints and models. His fingers tapped the keyboard, but his mind was far from the project. He had just returned from another business trip, and his mind was still clinging to the morning he had spent with Caitlin. Her coldness, her evasive gaze, the receipt for a watch he had never seen, all of it swirled around in his head like bees in a hive. He tried to focus on his work, but every time he glanced at the screen, her figure, walking into the closet, phone in hand, appeared before his eyes. His assistant, a young woman named Emily, knocked on the door and walked in holding a folder of papers. "Michael, here are the latest revisions from the client in San Diego," she said, placing the folder on the table. "They want to add another floor. I said it was possible, but we'd have to recalculate the load on the foundation." Michael nodded, but his gaze was absent. "Thank you, Emily. Leave it, I'll take a look." She paused, noticing his tense expression. "Are you okay? You look out of place." Michael forced a smile. "Just tired. Business trips are exhausting." Emily nodded, but her eyes said she didn't quite believe it. When she left, Michael leaned back in his chair and opened the banking app on his laptop. He rarely checked their joint account. Caitlin had always handled the household finances, and he trusted her. But after that check, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping out of control. He scrolled through the transactions and froze. Almost $20,000 had been withdrawn from their account in the last 2 weeks, amounts that didn't match their usual spending. Boutique purchases, restaurants, even a transfer to an unknown account. His heart sank. He closed the laptop, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. It could have been anything: gifts, charity, impulse purchases. But why hadn't she said anything? Why had her behavior become so alien? Michael pulled out his phone and dialed the number of an old friend, Tom, a former police officer who now worked as a private investigator. "Tom, it's Michael," he said when Michael answered. "I need your help. Nothing serious, just want to check something." "Give me the name," Tom replied, his voice calm but businesslike. "And what exactly do you want to know?" Michael paused. Saying it out loud was like jumping into an abyss. "Caitlin," he finally said. "Just keep an eye on her for a couple of days. I need to know what's going on." Tom didn't ask any unnecessary questions. "Give me a week. I'll get in touch." Michael hung up, his throat tightening. He hated himself for it. He hated that he suspected her, that he couldn't just ask. But he knew her answers would be as evasive as her eyes had been at breakfast. Caitlin and Ryan spent the morning at the hotel, but their encounters grew bolder. A few days later, when Michael left for another business trip, Ryan suggested meeting at the Reynolds house. Caitlin was hesitant at first. It was too risky, too close to her real life. But Ryan was persuasive. He talked about how she deserved freedom, how her life with Michael was a cage she needed to escape, and she gave in. The evening at the Reynolds house was quiet but tense. Caitlin opened a bottle of wine, and she and Ryan sat in the living room where she had recently hosted a party. Ryan looked around the room, his eyes sliding over the expensive paintings, the crystal chandelier, the leather sofas. "You've got this set up nicely," he said, sipping his wine. "But this all feels cold, like a museum." Caitlin laughed, but it was bitter. "Sometimes it is. Michael likes all the order, the control. And I just want to feel." Ryan moved closer, his hand on her waist. "Then feel," he whispered, and his lips found hers. Caitlin closed her eyes, letting herself lose herself in the moment. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a pang of guilt. She pushed it away, but it returned like a shadow that could not be ignored. Ryan, however, was no mere romantic. He saw in Caitlin not only a woman, but an opportunity. His life a series of temporary jobs, casual relationships, and debts was far from the luxury Caitlin lived. He knew she was his chance, and he knew how to play to her weaknesses. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" he asked, pulling away and looking into her eyes. "Just starting over, without him." Caitlin froze. Leaving Michael? The thought was both terrifying and tempting. She loved him or thought she did. But his world, his obsession with his work, his expectations, it all suffocated her. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "It's complicated." "It's not that hard," Ryan said, his voice soft but steely. "You deserve a life where you come first. Not his projects, not his money. You." Caitlin looked at him, her heart beating faster. She wanted to believe him, but something about his words sounded too smooth, too rehearsed. But she pushed the feeling away, letting the guilt dissolve in the wine and his touch. A few days later, Michael received a text from Tom. He was sitting in his office when his phone vibrated. "Meet me at 6. Got something to show you." Michael felt his stomach clench. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth, but it was too late to back out. They met in a nondescript downtown cafe where the smell of grilled burgers mingled with the aroma of coffee. Tom, a man in his 50s with a crew cut and tired eyes, placed an envelope on the table. "These are the first materials," he said, his voice even but wary. "Take a look, but be prepared." Michael opened the envelope, his fingers shaking slightly. Inside were photographs. Caitlin and a young man at a restaurant on Melrose Avenue. They were sitting close, too close. Her hand was on his, and his smile was one Michael hadn't seen on her face in a long time. He recognized the restaurant he and Caitlin had gone there a couple of years ago, when things were still good. Now she was there with someone else. "Who is he?" asked Michael. His voice was hoarse. "Ryan Collins," Tom answered, opening his laptop and showing the file. "Trainer at the Pulse Fitness Club. 30 years old, a couple of convictions for petty fraud. Nothing serious, but the guy clearly knows how to charm." Michael stared at the photographs, feeling his world crumble. He wanted to rip them up, throw them across the table, but instead he carefully folded them back into the envelope. "Keep watching," he said, his voice cold as steel. "I want to know everything." Tom nodded. "It will be done." Michael walked out of the cafe, feeling the city around him become alien. He loved Caitlin, but love couldn't take away the pain of betrayal. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let this destroy him. It wasn't that simple. Caitlin, home from yet another encounter with Ryan, stood in her bedroom, looking at herself in the mirror. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips were slightly swollen, and there was a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there in a long time. But with that sparkle came a feeling she couldn't ignore: guilt. She knew she'd gone too far, but she couldn't stop. Ryan was her escape, her protest against a life that had become a cage. And yet, looking at the wedding ring on her finger, she felt her heart clench. She heard the front door slam. Michael was back. She quickly fixed her hair, put on a smile, and went downstairs, ready to play the role of the perfect wife. But somewhere deep down, she knew that this role was getting harder. Late evening had fallen over Los Angeles, and outside Michael Reynolds's office, the city was a sea of twinkling lights. Skyscrapers stood sentinel over the streets, their glass facades reflecting neon signs and the occasional star that filtered through the smog. Inside the office, on the 30th floor, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional thud of the elevator down the hall. Michael sat at his desk, surrounded by blueprints and models, but his gaze was fixed on the thick envelope in front of him. It was a nondescript brown envelope, but he knew its contents could change his life. He didn't open it right away. His fingers, usually steady with a pencil or stylus, now hovered over the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. Tom, the private investigator, had given him this report only an hour ago, in the same cafe on the edge of downtown where they had met earlier. His words still echoed in Michael's head. "You wanted the truth. Here it is. But be careful, Michael. This isn't something you forget easily." Michael leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes darting around the office. The walls, lined with sketches of his projects, felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who still believed in his perfect life. He rubbed his temples, trying to ease the slight headache that was the result of the fatigue and stress of the last few days. The check for the watch, the missing money, Caitlin's evasive looks, they had all been a premonition. Now the truth was in front of him, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. He took a deep breath and tore open the envelope. Inside were photographs, text message printouts, and a USB drive. Michael started with the photographs. The first was of Caitlin and Ryan at a restaurant, the same scene he'd seen before, but now with new details. Her hand on his wrist, his smile, too intimate for a casual encounter. The next photograph was taken in the lobby of a boutique hotel on the Sunset Strip. Caitlin, in a flowing dress, was holding Ryan's hand as they waited for the elevator. Her face was lit up, as if she were in love. Michael felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to continue. The next few pictures were even worse. Caitlin and Ryan in a car parked in an alley. They were silhouetted in the dim light, too close together. And then the picture that stopped him in his tracks. Caitlin and Ryan in their own home. They were sitting on the couch in the living room, the same one where Caitlin hosted parties for his coworkers. Her head was on his shoulder, and his arm was around her waist. Michael recognized the place from the painting in the background, an abstract canvas he had chosen for their home. He put the photos down, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. His fingers were shaking, but not from anger. Not yet. This was something else, a mixture of pain and disbelief and a strange emptiness, as if a piece of his soul had broken off and fallen into an abyss. He picked up the text messages. They were intercepts from Ryan's phone, obtained by Tom through his connections. Michael ran his eyes over the lines, and each word cut into him like a knife. Ryan, have you ever thought about just leaving? Taking half his fortune and living the life you want? Caitlin, I don't know. It's not that simple. Ryan, think about it, Kate. You deserve better than being his shadow. We could go together. Michael clutched the paper so hard it crumpled. Divorce, separation of assets. The words echoed in his head. Caitlin hadn't just cheated on him. She'd discussed with this man how to ruin their lives, their home, their marriage. He tossed the printouts aside and plugged the USB drive into his laptop. It contained the audio recording from the restaurant. Ryan's voice, low and confident, was clear. Believe me, Kate, people like him don't change. He'll always put his skyscrapers above you. And me, I see you, the real you. Caitlin's voice was quieter, almost hesitant. I don't know, Ryan. Sometimes I think he still loves me, but I don't feel it. Michael turned off the recording. He couldn't listen any longer. His hands clenched into fists, but he wouldn't let the anger spill out. The anger was too simple, too destructive. He wanted something more. He wanted both of them, Caitlin, and this Ryan, to pay for what they had done. But not with screams, not with a scene. He wanted them to feel their world crumble, just as his was crumbling. Michael stood up and walked to the window. The city below was alive with life, cars crawling along the boulevards, lights flickering like stars falling to earth. He had always loved this view. It reminded him that he had created something meaningful, that his work was changing the face of this city. But now Los Angeles seemed alien to him, like the set for a movie in which he no longer wanted to star. He returned to the desk and opened his laptop. Tom attached a dossier on Ryan Collins to the report. Michael began to read, his eyes taking in every detail. Ryan Collins, 30, born in Oklahoma, moved to Los Angeles 5 years ago. Worked as a bartender, waiter, and trainer at several fitness clubs. 2 criminal convictions, one for shoplifting from a jewelry store, the other for credit card fraud. Nothing serious, but enough to tell you that this man was more than just a charismatic trainer. He was a predator looking for easy prey. And Caitlin, bored and dissatisfied, was the perfect target. Michael leaned back in his chair, his thoughts beginning to form a plan. He wasn't going to make a scene, he wasn't going to yell or break dishes. That wasn't his style. He was an architect, a man who built order out of chaos, reality out of ideas, and now he was going to build something new, a plan that would make Caitlin and Ryan regret what they'd done. He didn't know what the ending would be, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let them ruin his life without consequences. The next day, Michael took action. In the morning, he called his lawyer, Marcus Wellington, the man who had helped him with contracts and investments. They met in Marcus's office, an austere building on Wilshire Boulevard where everything from the leather chairs to the art on the walls screamed money and power. "I need to protect my assets," Michael said, sitting across from Marcus. His voice was calm but firm. "Everything I own accounts, real estate, investments. I want them safe." Marcus, a man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard, raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong? You don't seem like the type to just start this kind of conversation." Michael shrugged, trying to look casual. "I just want to be prepared. Life is unpredictable, you know." Marcus nodded, but his eyes said he didn't quite believe it. "Okay, we can move most of the assets into separate accounts, set them up in a trust. It'll take a couple of days, but it'll look clean. If anyone, say, in a divorce wants to lay claim to your money, they'll have a hard time getting it." Michael nodded, recording the conversation on the phone in his pocket. He didn't know why he wanted to record it, but his instincts told him that every step needed to be documented. "Do it," he said, "and do it quickly." The sun was setting when he left Marcus's office, painting the sky crimson. Michael got into his black BMW and drove home, but his mind was not on the road, but on Caitlin. He knew he had to talk to her, but he didn't want to show his hand. Instead, he decided to play a different role, that of the loving husband who didn't suspect a thing. At home, Caitlin met him in the living room. She was wearing a light dress, her hair loose, and a smile on her face that seemed almost genuine. But Michael saw her differently. He noticed every little thing now, the slight nervousness in her movements, the way she avoided his gaze when he asked about her day. "You're early," she said, putting a plate of salad on the table. "I thought you'd be late at the office." Michael smiled, and his smile was warm, almost gentle. "I thought I'd surprise you," he said, stepping closer. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling her body tense for a moment before she relaxed in his arms. "I missed you." Caitlin looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" she asked, a hint of guilt creeping into her voice. "Really?" Michael replied, holding her gaze. "Maybe we could have dinner, just the two of us, like before." Caitlin nodded, but her smile was tight. "That sounds great," she said, moving to the stove to check on what was cooking. "I'll make something special." Michael watched her, his face betraying nothing but calm. But inside, he felt his heart tighten. He saw her guilt, her hesitation, and it only strengthened his resolve. She had lied to him, betrayed him, but he wasn't going to let her know that he knew. Not yet. The evening passed in strange silence. They dined by candlelight, and Michael was more attentive than ever. He asked about her day, joked, and poured her wine. Caitlin laughed, but her laughter was unnatural, as if she were acting. She felt that something had changed, but she couldn't put her finger on it. His attention, his tenderness, it was all too unexpected, too much of a contrast to his usual reserve. "You seem different today," she said as they sat on the terrace looking out over the city. "Has something happened?" Michael shrugged, his smile soft, almost melancholy. "I just realized I've been spending too much time in the office. I want to be with you, Kate." Her face twitched. She wanted to say something light, but the words caught in her throat. The guilt she had so carefully suppressed was now rising inside her like a wave. She thought about Ryan, about his words, about how he made her feel wanted. But now, looking at Michael, she felt like a traitor. "That's sweet," she finally said, looking away. "I missed you too." Michael nodded, but his eyes were cold. He saw her lies, felt them, and in that moment, he realized that his plan wasn't just about revenge. It was a way to take back control of his life. He wouldn't let Caitlin and Ryan destroy everything he'd built. He would play their game, but by his own rules. Later, after Caitlin had gone to bed, Michael stayed in his home office. He turned on his laptop and reviewed Ryan's file again. Every detail, his criminal record, his debts, his habit of changing jobs added to the picture of a man who lived off others. Michael knew Ryan didn't love Caitlin. He was using her as he had used other women before her, and Caitlin, blinded by his charm, didn't see it. Michael opened a new document and began jotting down his thoughts. It wasn't a plan per se, more like sketches, ideas he would develop. He knew he had to be careful. One false move and Caitlin would suspect he knew. He had to move slowly, methodically, like an architect constructing a structure that would last for centuries. He closed his laptop and looked at the photo on the table, his and Caitlin's wedding photo. Her smile in the photo was genuine, full of hope. He wanted Caitlin back, but he knew it was impossible. That Caitlin had died somewhere along the way, and now he was dealing with a woman who had lied to him with her eyes. Michael stood up and turned off the light. Tomorrow he will start his game, and he would make them both regret it. The evening breeze swept through Beverly Hills, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the distant hum of the city. The Reynolds house rose from the hill like a glass beacon, its windows reflecting the sunset sky, ablaze with crimson and gold. Inside, however, the atmosphere was different, not the cozy warmth of a family home, but something wispy, almost tangible, like the web in which everyone in the house was entangled. Caitlin sat on the living room couch, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her silk scarf, her eyes glued to the phone on the coffee table. She was waiting for a text, but not from Michael. Her thoughts were on Ryan, on his words, on his touch, on the way he made her feel alive and vulnerable. Michael, home earlier than usual, stood at the bar, pouring himself a whiskey. His movements were slow, almost ritualistic, but there was a cold determination in them. He knew that Caitlin had noticed the change in him, his unexpected caresses, his attentions that he had been so generous with in the last few days. It was all part of his plan, his chess game, in which he was going to outplay both her and her lover. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her tension, her attempts to appear casual. It only strengthened his conviction that he was on the right track. "Want a glass?" he asked, turning to Caitlin with a small smile. His voice was warm, but there was a note to it she couldn't decipher. Caitlin flinched, as if his voice had pulled her out of some trance. "Oh no, thank you," she said, her lips twitching into a smile that faded. "I must have had enough wine with dinner." Michael nodded, but his eyes lingered on her a little too long. He noticed the way her fingers tightened around her scarf, the way her gaze darted to her phone as the screen lit up with a new notification. She didn't take it, but Michael saw her body tense, as if she were afraid he'd notice. He did, and that was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "I'm going to the office," he said, setting his glass on the counter. "I need to finish a couple of drawings. Don't wait for me if it's late." Caitlin nodded, her face softening with relief. "Sure, work as much as you need," she replied, her voice almost too light, as if she was trying to hide her joy at his departure. Michael left the living room, but instead of heading to his office, he headed to his second-floor study. There, in the silence, surrounded by skyscraper sketches and building models, he opened his laptop. His plan was beginning to take shape. He knew that confronting Caitlin or Ryan directly would accomplish nothing. It would only destroy everything he had carefully built. Instead, he would attack their weaknesses, their trust in each other, and the first step was to sow the seeds of doubt. He opened the anonymous email service he'd found the day before and set up a temporary address. Then he selected a few photos from his phone, snapshots from a recent dinner with Caitlin, when he'd been playing the loving husband. In one, Caitlin was laughing, her hand on his shoulder, his eyes full of tenderness. It was a facade, but Ryan didn't know that. Michael wrote a short message. "She's playing you. Do you think you're the only one?" He attached the photos and sent them to the number Tom, his detective, had given him. Ryan's number. Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling his pulse quicken. The first move had been made. Meanwhile, Ryan was sitting in his small West Hollywood apartment, the smell of cheap coffee mingling with the sweatpants strewn across the couch. His phone vibrated, and he lazily picked it up, expecting to see a text from Caitlin. Instead, he saw an unfamiliar number and photos that made him frown. Caitlin, smiling with her husband. They looked happy, too happy. The message was short but venomous. "She's playing with you. Do you think you're the only one?" Ryan felt his blood boil. He knew Caitlin was married, knew their relationship was playing with fire. But he thought he was in control. He thought Caitlin was his ticket to another world, a world of money and opportunity. And now someone who was hinting that she was using him. He scrolled through the photos again, his gaze caught on Caitlin's hand on her husband's shoulder. This wasn't just a photo. This was a warning. He dialed her number, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles were white. Caitlin answered on the third ring, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Ryan, is something wrong?" "Tell me," he snapped, his voice harsh, and without its usual playfulness. "What's this game, Kate? Are you still running to your hubby when I'm not looking?" Caitlin froze on the couch. Her heart pounded as if someone had punched her in the chest. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't understand." "Don't pretend," Ryan snapped. "They sent me pictures. You and him, all happy. You think I'm an idiot? You think I can't see how you keep him hooked while you're screwing me?" Caitlin felt her throat tighten. Pictures? Who could have sent them? She remembered dinner with Michael, his unexpected tenderness, his questions about her day. Did he know? No, that was impossible. He was too wrapped up in his work, too trusting of her. Or was he? "Ryan, this is crazy," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Someone is trying to break us up. I'm not playing with you." "Then prove it," he said, his tone growing colder. "If you're serious, I want assurances. I'm not going to be your plaything, Kate. I want money. 50,000, right now." Caitlin gasped, her hand tightening on her phone. 50 grand? Are you crazy? How do I get that kind of money?" "Don't lie to me," Ryan snapped. "I know how much your husband has in his accounts. If you don't want him to know about us, you'll find a way." Caitlin felt her world begin to crumble. She knew Ryan wasn't kidding. His voice, his threats, this wasn't the man who'd held her in the hotel room, whispering that she deserved better. This was a predator who'd sensed weakness. She hung up, her hands shaking. She needed time to think, but time was a luxury she didn't have. The next day, Caitlin sat in her office, a small room she used to plan charity events and meet up with friends. She opened her laptop and logged into their joint bank account, hoping to find a way to make things right with Ryan. But when she saw the balance, her heart sank. The account, which usually held hundreds of thousands of dollars, was nearly empty. There were only a few thousand left, a sum that wouldn't even cover her usual monthly expenses. She refreshed the page, thinking it was a mistake, but the numbers didn't change. Panic washed over her. Michael. It could only be him. But how? He'd never kept such close tabs on their finances. Did he know? She remembered the look in his eyes at dinner, the smile that had seemed too warm, too unnatural. Her fingers trembled as she closed the laptop. She had to do something, and fast. Caitlin went up to the bedroom and opened the safe hidden behind a painting in the walk-in closet. Her jewelry was in their gifts from Michael, family heirlooms, rings and necklaces that cost a fortune. She picked out the diamond necklace and pair of earrings Michael had given her for their 10th anniversary. Her hands shook as she put them in her bag. She hated herself for it, but she had no choice. Ryan wasn't kidding, and she couldn't let him ruin her life. She met him that evening in an alley behind the gym, where shadows hid them from prying eyes. Ryan was leaning against the wall, his face grim, his eyes cold. Caitlin held out the bag of jewelry to him, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "That's all I can do now. Please, Ryan, don't do this." He opened the bag, his fingers running over the diamonds. "Not bad," he said, but his smile was crooked. "But this is just the beginning, Kate. If you want me to keep quiet, you'll have to try harder." Caitlin felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scream, to hit him, but instead she just nodded. "I'll find a way," she whispered, turning and walking into the darkness. Michael, sitting in his office, received a text from Tom. He got your pictures. The reaction was violent. They met today. She gave him something in her bag. Michael nodded, his face showing nothing but cold satisfaction. His plan was working. He knew Ryan would become suspicious of Caitlin, and that was just the beginning. He wanted them to destroy each other, to let their own greed and mistrust become their punishment. He opened his laptop and checked his accounts. The money he'd transferred to the secure accounts was safe. Caitlin must have noticed by now that their joint account was empty. That was move two, to take away her financial freedom, to make her panic. He knew she'd turned to jewelry, and that was part of his plan. He'd installed a camera in the dressing room, disguised as a smoke detector, to record her actions. He wasn't going to use the recordings right away, but they were his insurance. Caitlin came home late, her face pale and her eyes red from the tears she was holding back. She went into the bedroom without turning on the light and lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts were as chaotic as a storm. Ryan, Michael, the empty account, the photos, all of it was tangled into a tangle she couldn't unravel. She knew she'd gone too far, but she couldn't see a way back. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she began to suspect that Michael wasn't as simple as he seemed. His recent tenderness, his questions, his look, it was all too unnatural. But the thought that he knew was too scary to accept. She closed her eyes, hoping that sleep would take her away from reality. But reality was inexorable, and the web she found herself in grew tighter. Twilight had fallen over Beverly Hills, and the Reynolds home glowed like a jewel set in palms and magnolias. Its glass walls reflected the warm light of crystal chandeliers, and the open patio doors wafted the scent of a blooming garden, mingling with subtle notes of truffle oil and freshly baked bread. Inside, the bustle was not chaotic, but carefully calibrated, like a scene from a Hollywood movie. Waiters in black vests glided among the guests, carrying glasses of sparkling champagne and exquisite hors d'oeuvres. Tartlets with beluga caviar, mini croissants with foie gras, slices of marinated tuna garnished with microgreens. Tonight's dinner was more than a social event. It was a chess game in which Michael Reynolds was about to make the decisive move. The living room, spacious and sophisticated, was filled with people whose names meant a lot in the world of Los Angeles. There were investors whose millions supported Michael's projects, architects who admired his talent, and a couple of local celebrities whose presence added sparkle to the evening. Jonathan Clark, Michael's longtime partner, was chatting with an interior designer whose work adorned the Rodeo Drive penthouses. Caitlin's friend Laura was chatting about a new spa in Malibu, her laugh ringing like a bell, but with a hint of pretense. Everyone was playing a role, but no one knew that the evening was not scripted for their enjoyment. Michael stood by the fireplace, a glass of aged Bordeaux in his hand. His navy blue tailored suit showed off his trim frame, and the slight gray at his temples gave him the look of a man who knew how to keep things under control. His smile was reserved, but there was genuine warmth in it, as if he was enjoying every moment. And he was enjoying it, not the wine, not the conversation, but the anticipation. Tonight, he was going to shatter the illusions that Caitlin and Ryan had so carefully constructed. Caitlin, on the other hand, looked like the picture of elegance, but her movements betrayed the tension within her. Her dress was a flowing, deep emerald green that emphasized her slender figure, and her diamond earrings sparkled with every turn of her head. She moved from one group of guests to another, her smile flawless but her eyes anxious. The last few days had been a nightmare for her. Ryan's threats, her empty bank account, the suspicion that Michael knew something. She tried to hold on, but every look from him, every unexpected caress from him, made her heart beat faster with fear. Tonight's dinner, which Michael had insisted on hosting, seemed strange to her, but she couldn't refuse. She had to play her part. "Caitlin, you are simply divine," Laura sang, approaching her with a glass of champagne. "This dress, it's like it was made for you." "Thank you," Caitlin said, her voice soft but tired. "Michael chose it, said he wanted me to shine today." Laura raised an eyebrow, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "He's been so attentive lately, just like on our honeymoon. What did you do to him?" Caitlin forced herself to laugh, but it was strained. "Just trying to be a good wife," she replied, looking away. She could feel her cheeks burning and took a quick sip of champagne to hide her embarrassment. At that moment, the living room doors opened and a new guest walked in. Caitlin froze, her glass almost slipping from her hands. Ryan Collins. He was dressed in a dark jacket and a white shirt. His hair was neatly styled, and his smile was the same one that had once made her heart flutter. But now it seemed threatening to her. What was he doing here? Her gaze darted to Michael, who was already walking toward Ryan, his face glowing with hospitality. "Friends, let me introduce you," Michael said loudly, attracting the attention of the guests. "Ryan Collins, our new trainer." Caitlin recommended him, and I must say, she was not mistaken. He is a real professional. The guests applauded, but Caitlin felt her legs buckle. She looked at Ryan, who nodded at her with a small smile, but his eyes were cold, almost predatory. She wanted to scream, to run, but instead she stayed where she was, her fingers gripping her glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. Michael knew. He had to know. But how? And why was he doing this? Ryan, for his part, felt out of place. He'd agreed to come when Michael called, introducing himself as a grateful husband who wanted to meet his wife's trainer. Ryan had seen it as an opportunity, a chance to cement his influence with Caitlin, maybe even find some new rich clients. But now, standing in this room, surrounded by people whose watches cost more than his annual salary, he felt cornered. Michael was smiling at him, but there was something about that smile that made his skin crawl. "Thank you for inviting me, Michael," Ryan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's an honor to be here." "Oh, believe me, we're glad," Michael replied, clapping him on the shoulder. His gesture was friendly, but there was a hint of steel in it. "Caitlin's told me a lot about you. You must be a real wizard to be so keen on training." The guests laughed, but Caitlin felt her face burn. She wanted to sink into the ground. She looked at Ryan, hoping he would understand her silent plea for silence, but his eyes were unreadable. She knew he was angry the photos someone had sent him still burned his pride. But she couldn't explain, not here, not now. The guests were seated at a long table in the dining room, decorated with a crisp white tablecloth and orchid arrangements. Candlelight reflected off crystal glasses, creating the illusion of coziness, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. Michael took the seat at the head of the table, Caitlin across from him, and Ryan found himself between Laura and one of Michael's investors, a man named Richard, whose penchant for gossip was well known. Dinner began with light conversation. Michael's new project, trendy restaurants, rumors that some Hollywood star was buying an estate in Malibu. Michael was the center of attention, his voice calm but commanding, as if he were conducting an orchestra. Caitlin, on the other hand, was unusually quiet, her answers short, her smile strained. She felt Ryan's gaze burning into her, and she tried not to look in his direction. "Caitlin, my dear, you seem so thoughtful today," Jonathan remarked, sitting next to her. "Are you okay?" "Oh, I'm fine," she replied, her voice a little higher than it needed to be. "Just enjoying the evening." Michael looked at her, his eyes glittering in the candlelight. "Caitlin always makes the evening unforgettable," he said, raising his glass. "To my wife, who makes my life brighter." The guests joined in the toast, but Caitlin felt her stomach clench. His words sounded sincere, but there was an underlying irony to them that only she seemed to notice. She sipped her wine, hoping it would calm her nerves, but her hands still shook. Ryan, a few seats away, watched the scene with growing irritation. He hated this world, the world of rich, smug people who looked at him like he was a servant. But most of all, he hated Michael, his calm, his confidence, his power. Ryan felt trapped, but he couldn't figure out how to get out. "Ryan, tell us about yourself," Michael said suddenly, his voice light but sharp. "Caitlin says you're a real pro. Where did you work before Pulse?" Ryan's expression stiffened, his smile tight. "Oh, here and there," he said, trying to sound casual. "A few clubs in LA, a few in Vegas. I like helping people achieve their goals." "Interesting," Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on Ryan. "Vegas must be full of temptations. I guess one has to be careful not to get into trouble." The guests laughed, but Ryan felt his jaw tighten. He knew Michael was hinting at something, but he couldn't respond without giving himself away. He glanced at Caitlin, hoping she would intervene, but she was staring at her plate, her face pale. "Oh, Ryan's doing great," Laura put in, her voice playful. "Caitlin says he's a wizard. I'm thinking of signing up for one myself." "I'm sure he'll find time for you," Michael said, his smile almost predatory. "Although, I've heard that some coaches have troubled pasts. It's okay, of course. Everyone makes mistakes. The main thing is not to repeat them." Ryan felt his blood boil. He knew what Michael was talking about. His convictions were minor, but incriminating enough to ruin his reputation in this circle. He wanted to get up, to leave, but he knew that would look like defeat. Instead, he forced a smile. "We all learn from our mistakes," he said, his voice even but menacing. Caitlin, listening to this exchange, felt her world crumble. Michael knew. He knew about Ryan, about his past, about their connection. But why wasn't he screaming, accusing her? Why was he playing this game, where every word he said was like a knife stabbing her heart? She wanted to get up, to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The waiters brought out the main course, filet mignon with red wine sauce and truffle puree, but Caitlin barely touched her food. Her eyes darted between Michael and Ryan, as if trying to anticipate what would happen next. Michael, on the other hand, was calm, even cheerful. He told stories about his projects, joked with the guests, but his words to Caitlin were laced with hidden meaning. He said, addressing everyone at the table, "marriage is like building a house. You have to lay a solid foundation, but even then cracks can appear. The main thing is to notice them in time." The guests nodded, but Caitlin felt her throat tighten. She knew he was talking about her, about them. She wanted to say something, but her voice betrayed her. Instead, she took another sip of wine, feeling her cheeks burn. Michael looked at her, his eyes cold despite his smile. "Caitlin, do you agree?" he asked, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the napkin. "Of course," she said, her voice barely audible. "We have to try." The guests fell silent, sensing that something was happening, but not understanding what it was. Ryan, sitting off to the side, looked at Michael with mounting hatred. He knew he was losing, but he couldn't understand how it had happened. He thought he had control over Caitlin, that she was his ticket into this world. But now he saw that she herself was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The climax came when dessert was served, chocolate fondant with raspberry sorbet. Michael stood up, glass in hand, and all eyes turned to him. His face was calm, but there was a sense of power in it, as if he was about to change the course of history. "Friends," he began, his voice firm but soft as velvet. "Tonight is a special night for me. I want to thank you for your support, for sharing these moments with us. And I especially want to thank Caitlin." He looked at her, and her heart stopped. She knew something was going to happen, but she couldn't predict what it was. "Caitlin," Michael continued, his voice quieter, but each word like a blow. "You gave me years I'll never forget, but sometimes life forces us to make difficult decisions. I've filed for divorce." The guests gasped, their whispers filling the room. Caitlin felt her face go pale, her world crumbling. She looked at Michael, her lips trembling, but she couldn't speak. His eyes were cold, but there was no anger in them, only determination. "It's not easy," he continued, his voice even. "But I believe it's the best path for both of us. And Ryan," he turned to face him, his smile sharp as a blade. "Thank you for your help. Although, I'd advise you to be careful. I heard you've had some trouble with the law in the past. Fraud, I believe. I hope you're on the right track now." Ryan went pale, his fists clenched under the table. The guests began to whisper, their eyes darting between him and Michael. Laura covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Ryan knew he had lost. His reputation, his plans, all in one moment. He stood up, his chair creaking, and threw his napkin on the table. "Thank you for the evening," he said, his voice hoarse. He looked at Caitlin, but there was nothing but contempt in his gaze. Then he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Caitlin couldn't breathe. She felt the tears stinging her eyes, her body shaking. She stood up, her chair falling with a thud, and ran from the room, her dress flapping like a flag of surrender. She heard the guests whispering, Michael continuing to speak, but his words reached her as if they were underwater. She ran to the bedroom and slammed the door, her tears finally breaking through like a storm. Michael remained standing, his glass still in his hand. He looked at the guests, his face unreadable. I apologize for the scene, he said, his voice calm. Sometimes the truth requires sacrifice. Continue to enjoy the evening. The guests began to whisper, but no one dared to ask a question. Michael sat up, his movements slow, almost regal. He knew he had won. Caitlin and Ryan were broken, their secrets exposed. But the victory brought him no joy. Somewhere deep inside, he felt empty, as if he had destroyed not only them, but a part of himself. Caitlin sat on the bed, her face wet with tears. She knew she deserved it, but the pain was unbearable. Michael hadn't just learned the truth, he'd used it as a weapon to destroy her. She remembered their years together, their laughter, their dreams, and now it all seemed like a mirage. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. She hated herself. Ryan felt his rage turn to despair as he walked down the street. He knew his game was up. His reputation was ruined, his plans were dust. He thought about Caitlin, how she had betrayed him, but now he realized she was as much a pawn as he was. He paused, looking out over the city, and realized that Los Angeles was no longer his. Los Angeles was walking slowly, like a city tired of its own secrets. The morning fog was creeping down the streets of Beverly Hills, enveloping the palm trees and mansions in a soft haze. The Reynolds house, which had shone like a symbol of luxury only yesterday, now seemed empty, as if its soul had departed with the guests who had left the dinner party. The silence inside was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under Michael Reynolds's footsteps. He stood in his office, looking out at the city through the picture window, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his dark trousers, his face as impassive as granite. Last night had been his triumph, the culmination of a carefully planned revenge, but the victory had left only a cold emptiness in his chest. On the table in front of him was an envelope of evidence collected by Tom, his private investigator. Photos, recordings of conversations, videos of Caitlin in the closet taking jewelry from the safe. Michael felt no joy in looking at this evidence. He felt tired, as if years of their marriage, their love, their dreams had been consumed by a fire he had started. But he wasn't going to stop. His plan was only half complete. Caitlin and Ryan would pay the full price for their betrayal, and he would make sure it was done legally. Michael picked up the phone and dialed Tom's number. "Everything ready?" he asked, his voice even but with a hint of steel in it. "Yes," Tom replied, his tone businesslike, but with a note of sympathy. "I handed the case over to the police last night. They're on their way to Collins. They've got enough to arrest him blackmail, theft, even attempted extortion. He won't get away with it." Michael nodded, though Tom couldn't see him. "Okay, keep me posted." He hung up and looked at the photograph on the table, his and Caitlin's wedding photo, the one he'd looked at so many times in the last few weeks. Her smile in the picture had been bright, full of hope, and his eyes had been full of love. It seemed like a distant memory now, like someone else's life. He picked up the picture, his fingers lingering on her face, but then he put it in the drawer. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, in Ryan Collins's cramped West Hollywood apartment, the morning began with a sharp knock on the door. Ryan, still reeling from the humiliation of the previous night, sat on the couch, sipping a cheap beer. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his thoughts were chaotic. He knew last night's dinner had been a trap, but he couldn't figure out how Michael had found out. His plans to use Caitlin to get access to her money to start a new life had collapsed like a house of cards. And now there was this knock on the door. "Open up, police," came a voice, sharp and commanding. Ryan froze, his beer bottle almost slipping from his hands. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew there was no point in running. His apartment was on the 4th floor, and the only way out was through the door where the officers were standing. He opened it, and two uniformed policemen walked in, their faces unreadable. Ryan Collins, one of them asked, his hand on his holster. "Yeah," Ryan replied, his voice hoarse. "What's the matter?" "You are under arrest on charges of blackmail and theft. Let's go." Ryan felt his world crumble completely. He knew it had to do with Caitlin, with her jewelry that he had taken, threatening to expose their affair. But how had the police known? He looked at the handcuffs that snapped onto his wrists and knew that this was the end. Michael. It was him. Ryan didn't know how, but he was sure it was him. As he was being led out of the apartment, he glanced at his phone, lying on the table. There was an unread message from Caitlin on the screen. "We need to talk. Please." He chuckled, but there was nothing but bitterness in his laughter. She was as guilty as he was, but now he alone would pay the price. Caitlin woke up in a bedroom that didn't feel like hers anymore. The sheets were cold, the pillows were rumpled, and the air in the room was heavy, like after a thunderstorm. Last night's dinner was still in her mind's eye. Michael's words, his cold gaze, the gasps of the guests, Ryan's flight. She knew it was over. Her marriage, her life, her illusions, all shattered. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, the tears she had shed that night leaving dark circles under her eyes. She went down to the kitchen, hoping to find Michael, but the house was empty. There was a note on the table. "I'm in the office. We need to talk. M." Her heart sank. She knew this would be the last conversation. She opened her laptop to check her bank account, still hoping it was a mistake, that the money would be returned. But the account was empty, just like yesterday. She remembered the jewelry she had given Ryan and felt her throat tighten. She had sold a part of herself to keep her secret, but it didn't matter now. Caitlin walked into the closet and opened the safe. It was almost empty, just a few small pieces of jewelry that weren't worth a tenth of what she'd given Ryan. She closed the door and leaned against the wall, her breathing ragged. She needed to leave, to start over, but how? She had nothing, no money, no home, no future. She remembered her modeling career, her dreams, her independence. It all seemed so far away, like someone else's life. She picked up her phone and dialed her friend Laura, but she didn't answer. Caitlin knew that after last night, rumors were already spreading like a spider's web. She was alone. She opened a job board and started looking for something that might give her a chance. Waitress, receptionist, even a salesperson at a boutique, anything to survive. Her fingers shook as she sent off her resume, but deep down she knew that this was only the beginning of her downfall. Michael sat in his office, looking out over the city that had once been his dream. Now it seemed foreign to him, like the set of a movie he no longer wanted to star in. He received a text from Tom. "Collins has been taken. He has the jewels. Case closed." Michael nodded, his face showing nothing but cold satisfaction. Ryan was only part of the problem. Caitlin was different. He didn't want to destroy her, but he couldn't let her go without consequences. He called his realtor and gave instructions to sell the house. "I want it fast," he said, his voice even. "I don't care how much. I'm leaving." The realtor, a woman named Sandra, was surprised but didn't ask questions. "Where are you going, Michael?" she asked, her voice soft. "New York," he replied. "Time to start a new chapter." When he hung up, he felt the weight on his chest ease a little. New York was a city of opportunity, a place where he could leave it all behind: the betrayal, the pain, the memories. He knew he would never forget Caitlin, but he didn't want to be the man who loved her anymore. Caitlin sat in a cafe on Melrose Avenue, watching the people walk by. Her bag, once full of designer clothes, now contained only the bare essentials: her passport, some cash, her phone. She had found temporary housing, a small apartment in a less than prestigious neighborhood, rented with the last of her money. Her new reality was harsh, but somehow liberating. She was no longer Michael Reynolds' wife. She was just Caitlin, and she was about to learn who she was again. She received a message from the manager of the beauty salon where she had applied. She had been invited for an interview. It was not the life she had dreamed of, but it was a chance. She finished her coffee and walked outside, feeling the sunlight on her face. For the first time in a long time, she took a deep breath. Ryan sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed. The officer across from him leafed through an evidence folder, his face impassive. "Do you have anything to say, Collins?" he asked. Ryan shook his head. He knew he had lost. The jewelry he had taken from Caitlin had been found in his apartment, and the recordings of his threats were in the hands of the police. He thought of Caitlin, of her tears, of her weakness. He hated her, but he hated himself even more for letting Michael outplay him. "I want a lawyer," he said, his voice empty. The policeman nodded and walked out, leaving Ryan alone. He looked at the gray walls, at his reflection in the one-way glass, and realized that his dreams of wealth, of a new life, were just an illusion. He was a pawn in someone else's game, and now it was time to pay. Michael returned home for the last time. The house was empty, Caitlin gone, with only a few things. He walked through the rooms, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The living room where they had parties, the kitchen where they had coffee in the morning, the bedroom where they had once been happy, it all seemed foreign now. He stopped by the fireplace where their wedding photo stood. He picked it up, his fingers lingering on her face. Her smile, her eyes, it was all part of another life. He opened the window and threw the photograph into a trash can on the street. He didn't look back. He picked up his suitcase, already packed, and walked out of the house, closing the door behind him. The car was waiting at the gate, ready to take him to the airport. New York was waiting for him, and he was ready to start over. Caitlin stood in her new apartment, looking out the small window at the city. Los Angeles was still beautiful, but it wasn't hers anymore. She knew she'd made mistakes, that she'd paid for them in full. But in that emptiness, there was something new, a chance to be someone else. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. New York greeted Michael Reynolds with a cold wind that walked through Manhattan, penetrating his coat and reminding him that this city does not forgive weakness. Standing on the balcony of his new apartment on the Upper East Side, he looked at the horizon, where skyscrapers pierced low clouds, and the city lights shimmered like stars that had fallen to the ground. His new home was smaller than the mansion in Beverly Hills, but the strict minimalism, glass walls, dark wood, gray tones reflected his inner state, a blank slate on which a new story had yet to be written. A month had passed since he left Los Angeles, selling the house that had once been a symbol of his success and love. Now it was just a memory, like a sketch of a building that would never be built. Michael held a glass of bourbon in his hand, his fingers lightly squeezing the cool glass. He didn't drink for pleasure. Alcohol was more of a ritual, a way to slow the flow of thoughts that kept returning to Caitlin, to her betrayal, to his own revenge. He didn't regret what he'd done. Ryan Collins, arrested for blackmail and theft, had gotten what he deserved. Caitlin, penniless and homeless, faced the consequences of her choices. But winning hadn't brought him joy. It had left a void that he'd tried to fill with work, new projects, a new life. His phone vibrated on the glass table, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Jonathan, his longtime partner. "Congratulations on your new contract. This project will take you to the next level." Dinner Friday, Michael smiled, but it was more habit than sincere. He had signed a contract to design a cultural center in Brooklyn, an ambitious project that could become his calling card in New York. But even that accomplishment couldn't drown out the echoes of the past. He walked into the apartment, closing the balcony door behind him, and sat down at his desk. There were sketches, blueprints, notes on it, but his gaze fell on the small box he had brought from Los Angeles. Inside was their wedding photo, the one he had thrown away but pulled out of the trash at the last minute. He didn't know why he had kept it. Maybe it was weakness, or maybe it was a reminder of who he had been before everything had fallen apart. He opened the box but didn't take out the photo. Instead, he closed it and put it away in a drawer. The past should stay in the past. Michael turned on his laptop and began working on the blueprints. His fingers moved across the touchpad, tracing lines that would soon become concrete and glass. He had always found solace in his work, in the way the chaos of ideas turned into order, into structure, into something permanent. But now, in the solitude of his new apartment, he felt like he was building not just buildings, but himself. A new Michael, one who would not trust so blindly, one who would not let emotion cloud his judgment. He knew the process would take time, but New York was a city where time moves differently quickly, inexorably, giving chances to those who were ready to take them. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Culver City, Caitlin sat at a rickety wooden desk, lit by a dim lamp. Her new reality was a far cry from the life she'd led just a month before. The walls of the apartment were painted a dull beige, and the furniture a threadbare couch, an old television, a couple of chairs was scavenged from thrift stores. On the table in front of her was a notebook in which she'd kept track of her expenses: rent, utilities, groceries. Her new job as a receptionist at a small spa in Santa Monica paid enough to survive, but not much else. She was no longer Mrs. Reynolds, the woman whose life had been adorned with diamonds and social events. She was simply Caitlin, and the name, stripped of everything else, scared her as much as it liberated her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror hanging on the wall. Her hair, once shiny and styled by a stylist, was now pulled back into a simple ponytail. Her skin, stripped of expensive creams and treatments, was still beautiful, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She remembered the dinner party, Michael's words, his cold gaze that had cut through her heart like a scalpel. She knew she deserved it, but the pain of his words, of his public announcement of divorce, still burned. She had lost everything: her home, her money, the friends who had turned their backs on her, when rumors of her infidelity spread across the city. Caitlin picked up her phone and pulled up some old photos. There were snapshots of her old life: her and Michael on a yacht in Malibu, her in Dior at a charity ball, her laughing at their wedding. She stopped at the last photo, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to delete it, to erase the past, but she couldn't. Instead, she closed the gallery and opened a job posting. Her job at the spa had been temporary, but she dreamed of something more. Maybe she should go back to modeling, or try her hand at design. She didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, there was a spark, not passion, like with Ryan, but something deeper: hope. She remembered Ryan, his threats, his cold gaze when he realized he had lost. She had learned of his arrest on the news. A local station had mentioned his name in a short report about blackmail and theft. She felt no pity, no anger, only emptiness. He had been her mistake, her escape from a reality that had been too much. Now she would have to live with that mistake, but she was determined not to let it define her future. Caitlin stood up and walked to the window. Los Angeles, her hometown, still sparkled, but she saw it differently now. It was not a city of opportunity, but a city of challenges, and she was ready to take them. She signed up for a graphic design course that started in a week. It was a small step, but it was hers. She no longer wanted to be someone's wife, someone's shadow. She wanted to be herself. Ryan Collins looked out at the world through the barred window of his holding cell. His life, once so full of ambition and hope, was now contained within gray walls and a metal cot. His arrest was not just a punishment, it was a humiliation. He knew Michael was behind it: his photos, his notes, his hand guiding the police. Ryan hated him, but he hated himself even more. He thought he was smarter, that he could outmaneuver the wealthy architect, who he believed was too busy with his blueprints to notice his wife's infidelity. He was wrong. His lawyer, a young guy with a cheap suit and tired eyes, had come the day before with bad news. The evidence was overwhelming. The jewelry Caitlin had given him had been found in his apartment, and the tapes of his threats were in the prosecutor's hands. Ryan might have been able to get a deal, but even at best he was looking at a year behind bars. He sat on his bunk, his hands clutching the edge of the thin mattress. He thought of Caitlin, her tears, her weakness. He had used her, but now he realized she was as much a victim as he was. Michael had outplayed them both. Ryan looked at his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. His face, once his greatest weapon, now looked haggard. He knew his life in Los Angeles was over. Even if he got out, his reputation was ruined, his connections were lost. He thought about what he would do when it was over. Should he go back to Oklahoma, or try to start over somewhere else? He didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, He felt like he had to change. Not for Caitlin, not for Michael, but for himself. Michael stood at LaGuardia Airport, waiting for his flight to Chicago. He had been invited to speak at an architects' conference, another opportunity to establish his name in a new city. His suitcase, small and practical, sat next to him, and he held his ticket in his hand. He looked at the people around him, families, businessmen, tourists, and felt like an outsider. His life in Los Angeles had been built on love, on trust, on dreams. Now he was building a new life based on the lessons he had learned from pain. He remembered the last conversation they had had, the day before he left. She had come into his office, her face pale and her eyes full of tears. She had asked for forgiveness, but he wouldn't listen. He had told her that the divorce was final, that the house had been sold, that they had gone their separate ways. She hadn't argued or shouted. She had simply nodded and walked away, her steps quiet, as if she were afraid to break the silence. Michael didn't know where she had gone, and he didn't want to know. She was part of his past, and he was ready to let it go. His flight was called, and he headed for the gate. He didn't look back. New York was his new beginning, and he was ready to take on everything the city had to offer. He knew the pain wouldn't go away completely, but it would become a part of him, like scars that remind him of battles, but don't stop him from moving on. Caitlin sat in her apartment, surrounded by design books and the laptop she was using to learn graphic design. Her new life was modest, but there was something real about it. She was no longer hiding behind the facade of the perfect wife. She was Caitlin, and that was enough. She opened the window, letting in the evening air, and looked out at the city. Los Angeles was still her home, but now she saw shadows as well as glitter, and she was ready to live in them. Ryan lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He knew he was in for tough months, but deep down he felt a strange sense of relief. His life had been built on lies, on manipulation, on the pursuit of easy money. Now, stripped of everything, he could start over. He didn't know what he would become, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. Thank you for watching this video. If you have experienced something similar, remember, you are not alone. Time heals, and everyone has their own path, but there is always a way out. Share your thoughts or stories in the comments. Let's support each other without judgment, with sincerity and understanding. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Maybe it will help someone else. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you in the next video. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.